If you think about it, comic books used to be, and it probably still is, it's the first literature a child will spend his own money on. Take money out of his own pocket and buy to read and to enjoy the artwork. That's very powerful that they make that decision. Think about it, they make the decision to spend their own money on it because they want it, and it's a form of literature. Comic books are an American art form that was started in the 30s in New York City. And comics are the bridge between the printed word and the motion picture. Guys like Will Eisner, Harvey Kurtzman, Alex Toth, Wally Wood, Jack Kirby, those guys were consummate storytellers, and they knew how to lead you across that page. They knew how to speed you up or slow you down as you read. And it was all the power of just being able to tell a story visually. When you have comics, you have panels, specific panels. It's a space of time. And when you go from one panel, there's a gutter. The next panel, there's a small space of time, there's a beat. So you could have a guy standing there, then a guy running off panel, and a guy gone. You've created a sense of motion. That's the power of comics at their best, is a guy that understands that and understands how comic books can create a wonderful sense of motion and a wonderful sense of humanity. Harvey Kurtzman's work is a great example of that. He's the guy who created Mad Magazine, worked for EC Comics, was legendary, did the legendary books, Two-Fisted, Frontline Combat. Some of those stories, even today, they're still studied. And they'll always be studied because the guy understood how to tell a story. That was his power. He was the writer, he was the editor, sometimes he was the artist. His stories were very, very personal for him, very powerful. And he wanted those stories to be treated with respect. That first generation that grew up wanting to draw comics, they loved it so much that they worked themselves to death, and there was this odd competition. None of them would ever say it, there was a competition, but there was, because if they were going to turn their work in, and they knew, for example, that Al Williamson or Joe Kubert or somebody like that was going to have a story in there, they didn't want their story to suck. They were going to make sure their story was great, because then they were going to work their ass off to make sure that their story didn't stand out as being inferior. They wanted to belong. And that's what stuff like Blazing Combat, Creepy and Eerie, the EC run, Weird Science, Two-Fisted Tales, Shock Suspense, that stuff was all about guys that were trying to elevate the field and not just bash it out and make a buck. They worked too hard on it. But in the 50s, EC was basically run by 3 or 4 guys, and then all the artists were freelance. But they gravitated there because they were doing superior work. They were doing stuff that was written for an older audience. They weren't trying to sell, shoes, the Buster Brown kitty shoes and stuff. They weren't trying to do Mickey Mouse. They were trying to do serious comic book stories, and they elevated the whole thing. And then, of course, the Kefauver trials and the Seduction of the Innocent book crushed them because they thought, believe it or not, that comic books were causing juvenile delinquency. Instead of celebrating the fact that kids are reading comic books, when Time Magazine did the top 100 books of the last 50 years, The Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons was in the top 50. And that's a graphic novel comic book. That's respect. When Art Spiegelman's Mouse wins a Pulitzer, and it's a comic book, even though they would never acknowledge in the press that it was a comic book. They would always say it's a novel with little pictures. No, it's a comic book. So you have to kind of change people's perception of that comic books are good for you. One of the sad things is EC Comics went under except for one book, Mad Magazine. Mad Magazine became a national institution, one of the greatest humor magazines that ever was made. And that's the ultimate revenge, is to live sweetly like that, with doing quality work and then, creating an American icon.